Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and in this next video we're going to talk about all of the formed elements of blood. So last video we went through and talked about all the different components of blood and what makes blood up, but this one we're going to focus specifically on the formed elements. Remember, the formed elements are the actual living cells in the blood. So the first one are the erythrocytes. These are the red blood cells. Leukocytes are the white blood cells, and then platelets are the cell fragments. So here is a really nice picture of blood. This is a blood smear. So the platelets are characterized by all of these little cell parts. So they don't really have a nucleus. They're really tiny. So those are all platelets. Then we have lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are actually a type of white blood cell. This is also a white blood cell. Whoops. All of these neutrophils are white blood cells. So white blood cells are going to be a little bit bigger and they're going to look like a true cell. And then you have red blood cells or erythrocytes. These are going to be all of these sort of brownish colored cells, all of those in there. So those three elements make up the different formed elements. There's red blood cells, white blood cells, and there's a bunch of different varieties of white blood cells, so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those. And then there's platelets as well, which are cell fragments. So here are some characteristics of the formed elements. We're not going to spend too much time going through these ones because we'll talk about all of them specifically, but this is a really good diagram that will tell you and show you kind of the differences between each of those different cell types. There's same thing, this will be all of the different leukocytes. So erythrocytes are the red blood cells. The leukocytes are the white blood cells, but they're divided into the granulocytes, which are the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils, as shown in this slide. And then this one will show you more leukocytes or more white blood cells, but it'll give you the agranulocytes, which are lymphocytes and monocytes. And then the last one are the platelets. So if you want to write down all of that stuff, you're welcome to, but you certainly do not need to. So the formed elements, erythrocytes were the first one we're going to talk about. The main function is to carry oxygen. So their surface area is actually, you can see that it's almost indented. To me, they kind of remind me of Cheerios, except for without, almost like Cheerios in milk, because they have that extra cell surface right here. It's just a little bit indented, or a biconcave disc. That shape allows it to have more surface area than volume, which allows it to carry more oxygen. So the anatomy of those circulating erythrocytes or red blood cells is that they are made up of a biconcave disc, which you can see here. So it's a kind of circular on the outside and then biconcave on each side. They're essentially bags of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is going to be what helps the oxygen attach to the cell. They're anucleate, meaning that they do not have a nucleus. A means without. The reason that this is really important because not having a nucleus allows the red blood cell to carry more oxygen. They also contain very few organelles for the same reason. They don't have to waste their space. They have valuable space where they're trying to hold as much oxygen as they can. So if they are able to reduce the nucleus and reduce the number of organelles, then they're able to increase the number of oxygen that they're able to carry. Then red blood cells, there are between 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, so that means you have a lot of red blood cells circulating at any given time that's helping to deliver oxygen to your body tissues. The next one here is hemoglobin. We're still talking about, we're still talking about red blood cells, and the hemoglobin is actually the iron-containing protein. Remember, iron as a element looks like this, Fe, and iron is always red. That's what helps keep our blood red. Remember, not blue, red. It binds strongly but reversibly to oxygen. This is a big deal because what happens is the affinity for oxygen will enable you to either basically the oxygen wants to diffuse onto hemoglobin, but it doesn't want to diffuse onto it so much that it won't let that oxygen go, because basically what you're doing here, if this is an artery, if you have a red blood cell with oxygen on it, if that's a red blood cell with oxygen, it's going to be delivered through your arteries maybe to, we'll just say that this is a cell. Okay, so if this is the cell, once that oxygen or once that hemoglobin and red blood cell get here, we will need to make sure that the oxygen will be dumped off and delivered to the body cells that need it. So it's important that it binds strongly, but it's also reversible to make sure that we still allow for gas transport to occur through our cell bodies and our capillary systems. Each erythrocyte has about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. That's a lot. Hemoglobin sort of looks like this. It's a quaternary protein structure. So remember, there's primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. This is a quaternary structure. And then a normal blood contains 12 to 18 grams of hemoglobin. So I don't necessarily need you to memorize those two facts, but each hemoglobin does have 4 oxygen binding sites, which you can see right here. So we have our oxygen, or I guess our red blood cell is here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 quaternary structures of hemoglobin there. So more about the formed elements. We're still talking about red blood cells here. So still in red blood cells, anemia is the decrease of oxygen carrying ability of the blood. So typically patients or individuals that are anemic are ones that have typically a low iron count. So basically women that are menstruating can run a higher risk of having anemia. Patients that are having blood issues can tend to be anemic, but it basically has to do with a decreased ability for oxygen carrying. Sickle cell anemia is a inherited genetic disorder, so it's going to look like this. If you remember from biology genotypes, it'll look big S, little s, and basically sickle cell shapes are that your blood cells, instead of being that biconcave disc like this healthy one, they're going to be in almost a crescent moon shape. The issue with sickle cell anemia is that it diminishes the ability of your red blood cells to carry oxygen. It also can be a really painful disease because it allows for that shape. Basically what can happen is different blood cells that are also sickle shaped can get hooked onto those areas, and they can almost form, not a clot, but kind of similar to that, where it's hard for your circulation and it doesn't carry as many oxygen molecules. And then polycythemia is an excessive or abnormal increase of the number of red blood cells that you have in your body. This is going to be a really strong increase in the number of red blood cells. So now we're getting to our white blood cells. So now we're into our leukocytes. So still talking about formed elements. There are 3 formed elements. You have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So this one goes through the leukocytes, or the white blood cells. So the important thing about your leukocytes is that it's going to be critical in your body's defense against disease. They're also going to be complete cells, meaning that they have a nucleus, they have most of the cell organelles. They're also able to move in and out of vessels. So this means they don't necessarily have to follow, remember we drew that artery, they don't necessarily always have to follow downstream of an artery. They're able to sort of move in and out of vessels as they're needed. They're able to move by amoeboid action, and then they're able to respond to chemicals released by damaged tissues. So for example, if you have an area of your body, we'll say that it's this little whitish area that is inflamed or has an injury to it or something, basically it will send out a chemical signal, and white blood cells will be the ones that respond to that chemical signal with sort of like a backup aid. It's going to help out. There are between 4,000 and 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, but those numbers are going to increase based on whether you're fighting an infection, whether you're sick, those kinds of things, or they'll be decreased if you are having a hard time with your immunity. So maybe you have HIV. Those white blood cell counts might be reduced long term. Okay, so we're still talking about white blood cells. There's different types of abnormal issues that can occur with white blood cells. The first one is leukocytosis. This is where your white blood cell count is above 11,000 leukocytes per millimeter, or Next up, this indicates that it's generally an infection. So that means if you have a really high number, you're going to be infected with something, whether it's a virus or a bacteria or something like that. Leukopenia, this has to do with having a low leukocyte number. This is common and it can be caused by certain drugs and anti-cancer agents that are trying to diminish your immune response. And then leukemia is a bone basically where your bone marrow becomes cancerous, and it turns out that you end up having excess white blood cells. Okay, there's different types of white blood cells. So a couple of slides ago I showed you I showed you some pictures of the granulocytes and the agranulocytes. So the granulocytes are really easy to identify because if you look over here, the granulocytes, you should see that they have a lot of little sandy grains in them. So they have granules in their cytoplasm that can be stained. So you're always going to look for those little spots. They look sandy. They also possess a lobed nuclei, and they include neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. Agranulocytes, A means without, so if you look at these ones, they do not have the little granules in those, so they do not have the cytoplasmic granules. Their nuclei are spherical or oval or kidney shaped, and they include the lymphocytes and the monocytes. And the next slide we're going to talk in detail about each of them. Okay, so the granulocytes are going to be made up of three. The first ones are the neutrophils. They have a multi-lobe nucleus, and I would say the most important thing to remember is that they act as phagocytes at active sites of infection. The eosinophils, also really important. They are going to be found in response to allergies and parasitic worms. So the neutrophils are going to be phagocytes. The eosinophils are going to be in response to allergies and parasitic worms. Then we have the basophils. Basophils have histamine containing granules, so they're going to be the ones that initiate inflammation. Then we have the agranulocytes. Those are going to be the lymphocytes and the monocytes. The most important thing I remember is that the lymphocytes play an important role in the immune response. We'll talk about that more when we get to the immune system. And then the monocytes, I would say that these are the macrophages. They are going to fight chronic infection. So in order to remember how common each of these are, there's a little memory aid that we can use. I always remember them by never let monkeys eat bananas. N stands for neutrophil, L is lymphocytes, M is the monocytes, E is the eosinophils, and B is the basophils. So this has to do with the list of them from the most abundant to the least abundant in your body. So of your white blood cells, you have more of the neutrophils than anything else. And then the last one we have to talk about, so we've gone through, we've talked about red blood cells and the iron and hemoglobin in there. We've talked about white blood cells, both the granulocytes and the agranulocytes. The granulocytes, again, were the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. The agranulocytes are the lymphocytes and the monocytes. And then the last one that we have to go through are the platelets. These are derived of ruptured multinucleate cells. We call them megakaryocytes. So the megakaryocytes are what gives rise to the platelets. It's a nucleate piece that they group like pieces of a nucleus together, and it ends up making a platelet. They're really required for the clotting process, which we'll talk about in the next couple of videos. And then the normal platelet count is about 300,000 of them. Here's an example of how the formed elements basically go through. It's sort of like their stem cells, even though they're not true like embryonic stem cells. They are stem cells because they're able to differentiate, just not as much as an embryonic stem cell. So basically you start with the hemocytoblast, which is the stem cell of the red blood or of the cardiovascular system, and they're going to those hemocytoblasts will either differentiate into lymphoid stem cells or the myeloid stem cells. The myeloid ones will give rise to the erythrocytes, the platelets, the monocytes, the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and basophils, whereas the lymphoid stem cells will give rise to the lymphocytes. And then platelets here is on its own, and the next video we'll go ahead and talk a lot about how these formed elements are developed and how they're used.